We can talk about that too. But, historically speaking, the pressures that a place like Germany are under are huge. And when something snaps, it all snaps. So the Russians are looking at the Western periphery here, and they realize that this is their last chance. If they don't do it now, it's not going to be done. And it appears that the Germans still have the capacity to reinvent themselves. Or they look south to the southwest and they see a Turkey that is one of the healthiest demographies in the world, one of the largest industrial economies in the world, that is bit by bit extending their influence throughout the broader region. Well, part of that broader region includes Crimea. So from the Russian point of view, history is nowhere near over. We were just on a bit of a pause for a while. Well, the Russians definitely see themselves as aggrieved, and they definitely see themselves in the victim role and a bit of a savior complex. The ongoing joke in diplomacy circles is that the problem with the Russians is they have a superiority complex based on an inferiority complex, as opposed to the Chinese, who have a superiority complex based on a superiority complex, but different topic. It doesn't require any facts for the Russians to feel aggrieved. They have this long historical diatribe from their point of view about all the people and all the countries that have done them wrong over the ages. And, in half the cases, at least, they've got a pretty good point. So especially once you constrict any other sources of information, the Russians are going to broadly believe what is on television, especially if they're over age 35, because they've got some memories of what it was like, both in the, if not the Soviet period, certainly the post-Soviet collapse, and there's plenty of angst to play on. I don't think that this war could have ever been averted unless NATO and the EU would have been a very different place, and that would have required different decisions around the end of the Cold War. We're far past that. When I look at a map, and let's assume for the moment that the Russians conquer all of Ukraine and stop, that doesn't solve their problem. That gives them a large-scale occupation, but does not solve and a big problem, 45 million people that you have to corral and control. But it actually makes their borders less stable because they have even longer borders that are even less secure. So if this is the end of it, this is really stupid. That's why I don't think they're going to stop here. It just fits the pattern of plugging the gateways one at a time. And I think what you'll see is once Odessa falls, the troops that are in Transnistria, which is this little sliver of a statelet that the Russians have backed since the 90s in eastern Moldova, I think that the troops in Transnistria are going to assist in the attack on Odessa. And once Odessa falls, the Russians will then be able to send regular forces all the way from their border in the east, the far eastern side of Ukraine, through that southern corridor by Mariupol, by Crimea, into Odessa, and then into Moldova. And I think that is going to wake up a lot of people about just how big their ambitions are here. And once that happens, everyone's going to have to redo the math and realize that the Russians really are in this with everything they have. Now, in the White House, I think there's a recognition that that has already happened. And so that's why we're seeing more forces going to Europe. We have a number of troops that have relocated. We have now abrogated every deal that we had with the Russians during the 90s, the 2000s, and the 2010s about not stationing forces in the eastern frontier. And we're seeing Patriot batteries going into places like Latvia and Poland and Hungary and, of course, Romania. So bit by bit and day by day, the Western response is strengthening as it kind of awakens to the scale of what it is the Russians are actually after. But again, we now know that in a direct American-Russian confrontation, the Russians will lose on the conventional battlefield. Which means if you've got 1 million or so Russians occupying Ukraine, the remaining tools are nuclear. They will not have the forces necessary to challenge the Western alliance and the Americans in particular, because they're going to be using too many forces to occupy Ukraine. So it is essential that they not leave Ukraine. They would have to control all of Ukraine's borders in order to get that. Now, by taking out Odessa, which is the primary port, that will really help restrict what the Turks are sending. But if you're talking about the Stingers and the Javelins, the air defense systems, all the anti-tank weapons that are coming in from the western side, you're talking about having to secure the entirety of the... They have already threatened the nuke card for that reason. Specifically, they've linked those two together. And I think everybody has called their bluff on that, because we saw absolutely no increase in preparation of their nuclear forces after Putin gave that order. And Putin... specifically, the Russian leadership in general has done this from time to time. So all the people that I know who are in the defense space are like, yeah, we take it seriously because it's nukes. But we didn't see any change. So we're watching, but we're really not overly concerned about that at this point. Yeah, also 5 months into the Putin administration back in 2000, they shifted their nuclear posture back to a first strike posture.
Right.
So this is something that has always been on the table. This is always something that's always been part of the discussion process. One of the many reasons why I really would like to keep this all done in Ukraine. There was a second question you had in there that I first the weapons. As long as it is a non-static weapon system, especially if it's man-portable, I don't think the Russians are going to do anything because there's really nothing that they can do. The only thing they can really do is bomb Poland. And then they've crossed the red line, and then all of a sudden we're talking about having the no-fly zone that the Ukrainians have been asking for becoming a lot more aggressive than just a no-fly zone. We're talking about the United States then neutralizing air assets in Russia proper. And the Russians are very certain that that would not be a good thing. So they're just taking it on the chin here. And they're going to take it on a lot more over the course of the next month. Because when this war started, the Ukrainians only had a handful of Stingers, only the ones that had been transferred from the Baltic republics. Well, American Stingers are now flooding in. And so in the next week or 3, we're probably going to see a dramatic uptick in the casualty rate for the Russian Air Force because all of a sudden the Ukrainians are going to be armed and able to do it. So this is going to get a lot bloodier on the Russian side as well in the very near future. Now, cyber, we were certainly expecting wide-scale cyber attacks, no doubt. Hasn't happened. It appears, and again, there's a lot going on behind the curtain, so we're not sure, but it appears that the Russian state has no hacking capacity outside of the bot farm. And as soon as they were limited in their internet access, the bot farm can't do a whole lot. All the hacking, it seems, came from Russian criminal syndicates, and Russia can't command them like they were a state agency because they're crime syndicates. And so we haven't seen an uptick in hacking from those groups. It's entirely possible that some of them are actually sympathizing with the Ukrainians a little bit. But again, this is one of those kind of broad spectrum things where our assessments of Russia just overinflated the threat so far. It's entirely possible that this is part of an incredibly complicated plan where they're trying to lure us into a false sense of security and then just blam us later. I don't know. Yeah, everything that we thought that they could do, they're not doing. So either they're holding it reserved for a later phase of the war or just our assessments were wrong. And with every extra casualty, every plane that gets shot down, every convoy that gets shot up, every day that the cyber doesn't happen, you got to wonder whether or not those assessments were just completely off.